The sirens cut through the cold Manhattan air as EMTs rushed Madison Hale into the emergency room, her body limp, her breath shallow. The city lights outside, the Mount Sinai Hospital flickered against the ambulance doors, casting a pale glow over her frightened face. Connor Blake followed close behind, pretending to be the devastated husband, wiping his eyes and asking every doctor for answers he already feared. Inside, nurses pushed Madison toward trauma care, while whispers began forming around the hallway. Nothing about her condition looked like a simple accident. Colton Hale, her estranged father, arrived moments later, his boots echoing down the corridor. He hadn't spoken to Madison in 3 years, but something inside him told him to come. When he saw Connor pacing with exaggerated panic, something felt wrong. The tension between them thickened, and doctors pulled Colton aside, lowering their voices as though revealing a secret too heavy for the air. Outside, reporters gathered, sensing a storm. Connor kept his head down, but his trembling hands betrayed him. And just before the doors closed, a nurse murmured a detail that shattered the room's silence. She didn't fall, someone knows. Before the night that shook Manhattan, Madison Hale lived a life so quiet that most people barely noticed when she walked into a room. She spent her mornings behind the counter of a small coffee shop in Queens, steaming lattes and wiping down tables while her coworkers laughed about weekend plans she could never afford. In the evenings, she hurried to her night classes in graphic design, clutching a worn notebook and hoping one day she'd earn enough to give her baby a better life. She was 6 months pregnant, and every flutter in her belly reminded her why she kept trying. To outsiders, Madison and Connor seemed like any young couple trying to build a future. But behind the closed door of their cramped apartment, the truth was crushing. Connor took control of everything: bank accounts, passwords, even her phone plan, insisting it was for stability. Madison believed him for a long time. She wanted their marriage to work so her child could grow up with a family she never had. But small red flags kept appearing. Connor rarely came home before midnight. He smelled of perfume that wasn't hers. He became irritated whenever Madison asked simple questions about their finances. And every time she mentioned the baby, he changed the subject as if the pregnancy was nothing more than an inconvenience. Still, Madison stayed gentle. She stayed hopeful. She stayed believing that love meant patience, even when patience hurt. She hid her doubts from her classmates, from her co-workers, even from her unborn child, hoping that silence alone could keep the fragile peace intact. Yet, deep down, a part of her sensed that the life she struggled to hold together was already cracking. And one night, everything would shatter when she learned Connor wasn't the only one hiding something. By day, Connor Blake walked through the lobby of his Park Avenue office tower like a man who owned the skyline. His tailored suits, sharp watch, and carefully rehearsed confidence made people assume he was a rising star in the consulting firm where he worked. He liked that image, needed it, actually. He greeted coworkers with a polished smile, pretended to check numbers on his laptop, and even joked with interns about making it big in Manhattan. But underneath the performance, Connor was slipping faster than anyone realized. His team was under investigation for irregular financial activity. His manager had started watching him closely. A major client threatened to walk away after noticing inconsistencies in a proposal Connor submitted. Still, Connor acted calm, brushing off concerns with the same charm he used on everyone, including Madison. But the cracks were widening. Behind closed doors, Connor stared at mounting debt notices on his phone. He owed money to people who didn't tolerate excuses. To maintain his lifestyle, he borrowed more than he could repay. And when the pressure grew unbearable, he looked for escape, something that felt exciting, validating, and far away from the responsibilities waiting for him at home. That escape came in the form of Sienna Brooks, a marketing assistant he met at a networking event. She admired him instantly, hanging on every word. Connor loved the attention, and soon he was staying out later, returning home with explanations he hoped Madison wouldn't question. He convinced himself he deserved something better. Something easier than the life he shared with her. Still, he kept up the illusion of the perfect husband, acting protective and proud whenever people were watching. No one could know how close he was to losing everything. And what Connor didn't realize was that someone in his office had already begun connecting the dots. Sienna Brooks entered Connor's life like a warm breeze, soft voice, bright smile, and an innocence that made people underestimate her. At 24, she was new to Manhattan, working as a marketing assistant in a trendy midtown agency. She dressed elegantly but not extravagantly, spoke gently but watched everything with sharp, careful eyes. People at her job often said she had potential, but no one knew how far her ambitions reached. Sienna wanted more than a career. She wanted power, stability, and someone who could open doors she could not yet reach. Connor, desperate for admiration, was the perfect target. Their connection started innocently. She complimented his presentation at a networking mixer, pretending to be impressed by his confidence. Connor, hungry for validation, responded immediately. Soon lunches turned into late-night meetings, and late-night meetings turned into moments he wished Madison never suspected. But for Sienna, this wasn't romance, it was strategy. She researched Connor, learned about his work troubles, and realized he wasn't as successful as he pretended. Yet she also discovered something valuable. Connor was emotionally weak and easily influenced. And weak people, Sienna believed, were the easiest to control. She started feeding him ideas how he deserved more recognition, how Madison was holding him back, how he needed someone who truly supported his ambitions. Sienna never raised her voice. She didn't need to. Her calm suggestions worked better than pressure. Connor began confiding in her, trusting her, depending on her. She positioned herself as his safe place, his escape from stress. But beneath her gentle exterior, Sienna was mapping a future built on Connor's resources and reputation. She wanted him to leave Madison, not out of jealousy, but because a wife and unborn child complicated her long-term plans. And as the weeks passed, Sienna formed a chilling conclusion. Connor wasn't her endgame, he was her leverage. The rain came down in sheets that evening, drumming against the windows of Madison and Connor's cramped Queens apartment. She had spent the whole day feeling uneasy, sensing something in Connor's behavior that didn't match the excuses he kept repeating. When he finally walked through the door hours later than promised, his shirt slightly wrinkled and his eyes avoiding hers, Madison felt her heart sink. She didn't want a confrontation, not while carrying their child, but she could no longer ignore the distance growing between them. She asked a simple question. "Were you really at work this whole time?" Connor stiffened. His answers were clipped, defensive, the way they always were when he needed to hide something. Madison kept her voice gentle, hoping to avoid escalating anything. She only wanted honesty, an explanation, a moment of clarity, something that made sense of the nights he stayed away. Instead, Connor accused her of being ungrateful, of questioning him when he was under pressure. His frustration filled the small living room until the air felt too heavy to breathe. Madison backed away, trying to calm the situation, but the tension kept rising. Words spiraled into sharper ones. She reached for her phone, thinking of calling Colton or even a coworker, just to feel safe. The movement startled Connor, who panicked at the idea of anyone else knowing about their argument. In the chaos of raised voices and hurried steps, Madison lost her balance. The room spun. Her hands reached for the edge of the table, but it was too late. A dull thud echoed through the apartment as she hit the floor, her breath knocked out of her. Connor froze, fear flooding his face. He hadn't expected anything like this, hadn't prepared for the consequences. And as he knelt beside her, whispering her name, one truth struck him cold. Someone would soon start asking questions he wasn't ready to answer. Rumors spread across the neighborhood before sunrise, drifting through stairwells and narrow hallways like a quiet warning. Neighbors had seen the flashing lights outside the building, and speculation grew faster than truth. Some believed Madison fainted from exhaustion, while others whispered about an argument no one heard directly. By the time the sun rose over Queens, almost everyone had a version of the story, except the one that mattered. Connor tried to control the narrative, calling coworkers and insisting nothing serious had happened, but panic shadowed every word. He rehearsed lines in his head, hoping they sounded believable if repeated often enough. Yet the more he tried to manage appearances, the more people noticed how uneasy he seemed. Meanwhile, Madison remained unconscious in the hospital, unaware that her absence stirred louder questions than her presence ever had. Nurses exchanged glances when Connor walked by, sensing tension he could not hide. Even the attending physician quietly noted inconsistencies between Connor's explanation and Madison's condition. Outside, a detective arrived to request routine information, but Connor froze when asked for a simple timeline. He stumbled through answers, revealing more fear than certainty. And as the detective walked away, he made a quiet note in his folder that suggested trouble ahead. Back at the nurse's station, someone finally said what everyone was thinking. This story doesn't add up. And in that moment, the first thread of Connor's carefully crafted lie began to loosen. Reporters started gathering near the hospital entrance, drawn by whispers of a case that felt more complicated than an accident. Inside, a young nurse checked Madison's chart and paused, sensing the quiet strength of a woman who had endured far more than anyone realized. She whispered a promise to protect her, unaware that her vow would soon change everything unfolding around. Colton Hale stood in the hospital hallway long after the doctors left, his calloused hands resting on the rail as he forced his breath to steady. 3 years without speaking to his daughter, and now he was watching her fight for her life. Guilt pressed heavily on him, but beneath it, an old instinct reawakened, the instinct that once made him one of the most respected investigators in his precinct. Something about Connor's version of events felt rehearsed, too polished, too conveniently timed. Colton had spent decades reading people, and Connor's eyes told a story he wasn't saying out loud. While Connor stepped out to take a call, Colton quietly approached the nurse's station. With calm professionalism, he asked for the preliminary report. It didn't accuse anyone, but the inconsistencies were enough to ignite suspicion. Madison's injuries didn't match a simple fall. And more troubling, a neighbor had seen Connor leave the apartment earlier that evening, contradicting his claim he'd been home the whole time. That detail sharpened Colton's focus. He left the hospital briefly and drove to Madison's apartment in Queens. The building's hallway still smelled of rain and metal from the EMT stretcher. Colton scanned the area, noticing a scuff mark on the wall, a displaced rug, and Madison's cracked phone left on the floor. He photographed everything, documenting quietly, methodically. A younger man might have overlooked those signs, but Colton saw the story they hinted at. Reaction, panic, movement. None of it aligned with a peaceful evening gone wrong. Back at the hospital, Connor reappeared, startled to find Colton already waiting. Their eyes locked, and for the first time, Connor hesitated. Colton didn't raise his voice. He didn't make accusations. He simply said one sentence that made Connor's pulse spike. "I'm going to find out what really happened, every detail." The morning after Madison's collapse, Connor returned to the hospital wearing a carefully practiced expression of concern. But no matter how composed he tried to appear, the people around him sensed a tension beneath the surface. A detective named Alvarez arrived to gather routine statements. Connor expected a brief conversation, yet within seconds he felt the questions tightening around him like an invisible net. Detective Alvarez asked him to walk through the evening step by step. Connor repeated the version he had rehearsed overnight, describing a quiet dinner and a sudden collapse. But the detective's brow lifted when Connor changed the order of events twice without realizing it. Alvarez didn't accuse him, he simply nodded, thanked him, and wrote down notes that made Connor's stomach knot. Colton watched the exchange from a distance, his instincts confirming what he already suspected. Connor was hiding something bigger than an argument gone wrong. Later that afternoon, the detective visited the apartment. The front door showed no signs of struggle, yet the placement of objects in the living room suggested hurried movement, not calm routine. A glass lay shattered near the table. The hallway rug was bunched as if someone had slipped or tried to regain balance. Nothing was conclusive, but everything felt off. And when Alvarez checked building security footage, he noticed something Connor had not accounted for. He had left the building earlier that evening, contradicting his claim of being home the whole time. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, a nurse discovered Madison's smartwatch in her personal bag. It had a fall detection alert time-stamped minutes before Connor claimed he found her. Even more unsettling, the alert had been canceled manually. Alvarez returned to the hallway, where Connor stood pacing. This time, the detective didn't hide his suspicion. "We need to talk again, Mr. Blake." Alone. The steady beeping of a heart monitor pulled Madison slowly toward consciousness. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. The lights were too bright, the air too sterile, and the weight in her chest felt unfamiliar. When she tried to move, a dull ache spread through her body, reminding her that something terrible had happened, something her mind couldn't fully grasp yet. A nurse noticed her stirring and gently approached, speaking softly, grounding her back into reality. "You're safe, Madison. You're in the hospital." Safe. The word didn't feel real. Her hand instinctively moved to her stomach, trembling with fear. The nurse quickly reassured her that her baby was still stable, but the worry didn't fade. Madison's eyes scanned the room until she found another presence at the doorway, her father, Colton. His face, usually stern and composed, was softened by relief and guilt. She hadn't seen him in years, yet here he was, standing as if he had never left her life at all. When Connor walked in shortly after, his tone overly sweet, Madison felt a cold unease settle over her. She couldn't recall everything from the night before, but fragments were beginning to surface, raised voices, tension, her phone slipping from her hand. She searched Connor's face for clarity, but his expression was rehearsed, too smooth, too careful. Colton stepped closer to her bedside, subtly placing himself between Madison and her husband. She sensed the unspoken conflict, the tension she'd been too exhausted to see before. Even in her weakened state, she felt something had shifted permanently. As the machines hummed around her and the city moved beyond the hospital walls, one truth settled heavily into her chest. Someone in that room already knew far more about the night she fell than they were willing to admit. Sienna Brooks sat at her sleek midtown desk, staring at her phone as unread messages from Connor piled up. Normally, she enjoyed the control she held over him, but that morning felt different. News traveled fast in Manhattan, and whispers about Connor's wife being hospitalized had already reached her office. A coworker casually mentioned detectives visiting the building where Madison lived, and Sienna felt a jolt of panic she couldn't disguise. She excused herself, stepping into an empty conference room overlooking Park Avenue. She replayed her last conversation with Connor. He had sounded frantic, more desperate than usual, begging her to confirm an alibi he hadn't prepared carefully. She brushed him off, assuming he was exaggerating again, but now the situation felt real, too real. If investigators started digging, they would find messages, photos, dinner receipts, and every trace of a relationship Connor had promised to keep hidden. And Sienna, who had always stayed just out of reach of trouble, suddenly felt trapped in the web she helped spin. She paced the room, heels tapping anxiously against the floor. Her ambition had made her reckless. She had pushed Connor to take control of his life, to stop letting his wife slow him down, yet she never intended to be tied to anything dangerous. Now, his problems threatened to become hers. Sienna considered deleting everything, disappearing from his life, pretending none of it ever happened. But her phone buzzed again, Connor pleading for help. She ignored it, pressing her palm to her forehead as dread settled like ice in her stomach. Across the river, detectives were already piecing together Connor's lies, and Sienna realized something terrifying. If Connor went down, he wouldn't go alone, he would pull her with him. Colton Hale returned to Madison's apartment building with a determination that startled even him. The rain from earlier had dried, leaving the hallway quiet, almost sterile. But Colton wasn't here for the scene, he was here for the people. Someone must have seen or heard something, even if they didn't realize it yet. Years of investigative instinct told him that answers hide in ordinary voices. He knocked on 3 doors with no success. Residents were polite but hesitant, afraid to get involved. When he reached the 4th door, an elderly woman cracked it open, her eyes cautious until she recognized his face from news reports. She had seen the ambulance, heard the commotion, but claimed she remembered nothing else. Colton thanked her anyway and continued down the hall. Just as he was about to leave, the elevator dinged. A man in his late 20s stepped out, carrying luggage and looking exhausted. Colton recognized him instantly from old building logs, Evan Parker, a freelance photographer who had been traveling abroad for weeks. Evan blinked at the sight of police tape near the apartment door. "What happened?" he asked, confused. Colton introduced himself carefully and explained only what was necessary. Evan listened, then hesitated, as if debating whether to speak further. Finally, he sighed and leaned against the hallway wall. "I wasn't here that night," he said, "but I saw something the morning before I left. Something weird." Colton's attention sharpened. Evan described hearing a heated argument through the thin apartment walls, a man's voice, sharp and strained, not Madison's. He also remembered seeing Connor leave the building in a rush, hours earlier than Connor had told investigators. It wasn't proof, but it was the first solid thread. Colton thanked Evan, shook his hand, and walked back toward the stairwell. Beneath the calm exterior, adrenaline stirred. For the first time, he had something that could unravel Connor's entire story. Back at the hospital, Madison slept under dim lights while machines hummed steadily around her. A young nurse named Lily quietly organized Madison's belongings, placing her purse, smartwatch, and phone into a labeled drawer. When she tapped the screen of the smartwatch to log the time of transfer, a notification appeared, an auto-generated prompt from Madison's cloud storage. Lily hesitated. It wasn't her place to pry, but the alert mentioned something unusual. Voice memo upload complete. Time-stamped just hours before Madison was found unconscious. Following protocol, Lily brought the information to Detective Alvarez, who returned to the hospital that afternoon. He retrieved Madison's phone, which had survived the fall with a cracked screen, and carefully accessed her cloud backups using emergency permissions granted due to the investigation. Within minutes, he found a folder labeled simply, "For Safety." Inside were a series of short audio recordings. Some were quiet arguments, others muffled conversations, where Connor's frustration bled through every word. But one recording stood out, the final file, captured minutes before the fall detection alert. Alvarez pressed play. Madison's voice trembled as she confronted Connor about something he tried to hide. Connor's tone was sharp, defensive, growing angrier with each second. Though the recording ended abruptly, the tension was unmistakable. It didn't show violence, but it created a timeline, one that contradicted nearly everything Connor had claimed. Meanwhile, Connor paced the hospital lobby, unaware that the walls around him were closing in. He rehearsed his alibi again and again, convinced he could outtalk anyone who doubted him. But upstairs, Alvarez listened to the final seconds of the recording once more, his jaw tightening. It wasn't definitive proof yet, but it was a spark. And Alvarez knew exactly what had to happen next. Connor Blake would be called in for a second, far more serious interview. Sienna Brooks sat alone in her apartment, staring at the city lights stretching across Midtown. Normally the view comforted her, a reminder of the life she wanted to climb into. But tonight, every flicker of light felt like a spotlight aimed at her secrets. She had ignored Connor's frantic calls all morning, hoping the chaos would somehow pass without touching her. But deep down, she knew better. Trouble always spreads, and she was standing too close to the source. When detectives contacted her workplace asking for a routine conversation, her stomach dropped. She had been careful never texting anything overt, never speaking loudly in public, but she knew that investigations weren't about what you said. They were about what they could prove. And Connor, under pressure, was the type to say anything if it meant saving himself. She replayed their history in her mind, how easily Connor bragged about manipulating coworkers, how he lied to Madison without blinking. If he could betray his wife, what chance did Sienna have? For the first time, she realized she wasn't Connor's partner. She was his shield. And shields were always the first to break. When Detective Alvarez finally called her directly, Sienna's pulse hammered. He asked for a meeting. She considered refusing, but she understood the danger of silence. It made her look guilty. So she agreed, but only after rehearsing the version of events that cast her as a bystander, someone who had been misled by Connor's charm. Still, fear clung to her. And as she scrolled through old messages between them, she noticed something she had forgotten. Connor once admitted he had insurance in case things went wrong. Insurance. What did that mean? Her breath caught, and a cold realization settled over her. If Connor had leverage, he might expect her to fall before he ever did. Connor arrived at his Park Avenue office, expecting to salvage what little control he had left. But the moment he stepped into the lobby, he sensed a shift. Coworkers avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Even the receptionist, who usually greeted him with a smile, simply nodded stiffly. Connor straightened his tie, forcing confidence he didn't feel, and headed toward the elevators. But when he swiped his badge, the light flashed red. Access denied. A security guard approached politely but firmly, asking Connor to wait in a nearby conference room. Panic prickled beneath his skin, though he kept his expression neutral. Minutes later, his manager and a compliance officer entered with solemn faces. They confronted him with questions about discrepancies in recent financial reports, discrepancies Connor thought he'd buried. Worse, they had emails showing unauthorized edits linked to his account. He tried to explain, but the arguments sounded flimsy even to him. Sweat gathered at the back of his neck as he realized someone had tipped them off, someone who knew where to look. Someone like Sienna. A folder was placed on the table, documents marked with irregular transactions, flagged invoices, and messages, suggesting he manipulated data to hide company losses. The investigation wasn't just internal anymore. Legal counsel had been notified. Connor felt the room shrinking around him. When they suspended him, effective immediately, he forced a tight smile, pretending cooperation. But inside, fury burned. He had trusted Sienna. He had given her everything she asked for. And now she had turned his world against him. As Connor walked out of the building, the Manhattan skyline no longer felt like a symbol of his ambition. It felt like a cage closing in on all sides. And he swore under his breath, if Sienna betrayed him, he would make sure she regretted it first. Detective Alvarez arrived at the hospital with a new level of certainty in his stride. The recordings, the witness statement from Evan Parker, and the inconsistencies in Connor's timeline finally formed a pattern impossible to ignore. Colton Hale waited in the hallway, arms crossed, silently demanding progress. Alvarez assured him the investigation was moving forward, then headed straight to the family consultation room where Connor had been asked to wait. Connor stood when Alvarez entered, trying to project confidence, but the detective didn't bother with small talk. He placed a folder on the table and opened it slowly, revealing printed transcripts of Madison's audio recordings, screenshots of building security logs, and notes from the apartment inspection. "We need you to walk us through the night again," Alvarez said calmly. Connor felt a pulse of heat rise behind his ears. He repeated the same story: quiet dinner, sudden collapse, but Alvarez interrupted to correct him, pointing out the moments Connor left the building, his shifting timeline, the fall alert manually canceled on Madison's watch. Connor tried to pivot, adjusting details, but every correction led him deeper into contradiction. Then Alvarez asked the question Connor feared most. "Why did you tell us you were home the entire evening?" Silence expanded between them. Connor stuttered, claiming stress, confusion, worry for his wife. But the detective leaned forward, voice low. "Your wife recorded the argument. We know there was conflict. We know you weren't honest." Connor's hands trembled beneath the table. He wanted to blame stress, Sienna, even Madison, but every excuse sounded weaker than the last. Alvarez finally closed the folder with deliberate finality. "We'll need to bring you in for formal questioning soon. And Connor." He paused. "Stories like yours always fall apart before the truth does." Connor's throat tightened as the reality sank in. The law had finally begun to corner him, and escape was no longer guaranteed. Sienna arrived at the precinct wearing a crisp blazer and the calm expression she practiced in the mirror, but the moment she stepped into the interview room, her confidence thinned. Detective Alvarez sat across from her, a file already open, his posture steady and unreadable. She tried to smile politely, pretending she had nothing to fear. But Alvarez didn't waste time. He slid a printed transcript across the table. "These messages came from your number," he said. "We'd like your explanation." Sienna scanned the page, recognizing fragments of conversations she thought were harmless, small criticisms of Madison, encouragements for Connor to stand up for himself, reminders that he deserved more. None of it looked illegal, but out of context, it looked manipulative, dangerous. She swallowed hard. "I didn't know what was going on at home," she insisted. "Connor told me he was unhappy, but I never pushed him to do anything harmful." Alvarez raised an eyebrow, then added another sheet to the stack, financial records from Connor's company showing edits traced back to Sienna's office login. Her breath caught. She had helped him format proposals and adjust slides, never realizing those files were part of a larger audit. Now her digital fingerprints sat at the center of a corporate investigation. "You may want to be honest with us," Alvarez said softly. "Connor Blake is already under scrutiny. If he feels cornered, he may try to protect himself, at your expense." The words struck exactly where she feared. Connor would save himself. He always had. She imagined him shifting blame, claiming she influenced him, insisting she knew everything. Panic tightened her chest. "I want to cooperate," she murmured. "I didn't understand the full picture, but I can tell you what I do know." Alvarez leaned forward, and Sienna realized that betraying Connor might be the only way to save herself from going down with him. The courtroom felt colder than Madison expected, its tall windows letting in thin strips of winter light. She sat beside her attorney, hands folded gently over her stomach, steadying herself as the judge called the session to order. Connor entered moments later, escorted by his lawyer, his once confident posture replaced by tight shoulders and darting eyes. Reporters filled the back rows, ready to capture the fall of a man who had spent years constructing a perfect image. Detective Alvarez presented first. He laid out the timeline with measured clarity, security footage showing Connor leaving the building, the smartwatch alert canceled, the inconsistent statements he gave, and the audio recordings Madison had saved for her own protection. Each detail chipped away at the narrative Connor fought to maintain. Then came the testimony that shifted the room. Sienna Brooks. She walked to the stand with trembling hands, avoiding Connor's stare. Under oath, she admitted to conversations where Connor complained about Madison being in his way, about needing his life clear before certain financial moves. Though she didn't accuse him of wrongdoing that night, her statements exposed his motives and his unraveling stability. Next, Evan Parker testified about hearing an argument and seeing Connor rush out earlier than he admitted. His calm, precise recollection contradicted Connor's version entirely. When Madison was asked to speak, she rose slowly. Her voice remained soft, but every word carried weight. She didn't accuse Connor directly. She simply described months of fear, confusion, and the growing feeling that she was losing herself inside their marriage. The judge listened, expression unchanged, then turned to Connor's defense. For the first time, Connor seemed unable to speak. Every escape route had vanished, and as the judge prepared to deliver the next steps of the case, one truth echoed across the silent courtroom. Connor Blake was finally out of places to hide. After the long days in court, Madison returned home feeling lighter, as though a weight she had carried for years had finally begun to lift. She moved into a small but bright apartment in Brooklyn, not far from the river. The space was quiet, filled with soft afternoon light that filtered through pale curtains. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe, truly safe. Her recovery became a slow, gentle routine. Each morning, she brewed tea, wrapped herself in a warm blanket, and opened her old laptop to revisit the design work she once abandoned. Healing wasn't dramatic, it was steady, almost ordinary, and that ordinariness felt like a gift. One afternoon, a package arrived at her door. Inside was a new Kindle from Colton, loaded with books he thought would help her rebuild stories of resilience, courage, and starting over. Madison smiled at the gesture. Their relationship, once strained, now felt like a bridge being rebuilt with careful hands. Colton visited often, fixing loose shelves, delivering groceries, or simply sitting quietly beside her while she rested. Her doctor, Noah Ellis, also checked in more than required. His visits were gentle, professional, but warm. He asked about her sleep, her appetite, her baby. Madison appreciated his calm presence, though she didn't expect anything beyond kindness. Still, she couldn't ignore how her heart eased a little whenever he entered the room. With time, Madison stepped back into the world. She accepted a part-time design internship at a small agency near Dumbo, where the Manhattan skyline shimmered across the water. Her co-workers welcomed her without judgment, giving her the space to grow again. And as she stood on the rooftop terrace after her first day of work, the wind brushing her hair, Madison understood something clearly. And she was no longer living in the shadow of what happened. She was finally stepping into the life she deserved. As winter softened into early spring, Madison's world continued to steady itself. She focused on her internship, her health, and the quiet joy of feeling her baby grow stronger each day. She didn't expect anything more than that, certainly not love. But life, she learned, had a way of placing the right people in her path when she least expected them. Dr. Noah Ellis first visited her Brooklyn apartment purely out of medical concern, checking her vitals and reviewing her recovery. But over time, their conversations drifted into gentle territory: favorite books, childhood memories, the challenges of starting over. Noah never pushed, never pried. He simply listened, offering the kind of presence that didn't demand anything in return. Madison found herself looking forward to his visits, not because she needed support, but because his calm steadiness reminded her that compassion still existed in the world. Noah often left small tokens on her counter: a cup of warm herbal tea, a comforting note, or a simple reminder to breathe on the harder days. None of it felt romantic, it felt human. One Saturday afternoon, after Madison finished a project at her internship, Noah met her near the Brooklyn Bridge to walk her home. The skyline shimmered behind them, Manhattan glowing like a promise rather than a threat. She talked about her hopes for the future, raising her child in a peaceful home, building a career she could be proud of. Noah listened with quiet admiration. When they reached her building, he hesitated before speaking. "You don't owe anyone anything," he said softly. But if you ever want company, real company, I'm here." Madison didn't answer right away. Instead, she smiled a gentle, genuine smile she hadn't felt in years. For the first time since everything collapsed, she realized something new. Love didn't have to hurt. Sometimes, it could simply feel safe. Spring sunlight poured gently through the tall windows of the courthouse as Madison returned for the final hearing. This time, she walked with steady steps, her father beside her, and a quiet strength radiating through her. Connor sat at the defendant's table. No longer the polished man who once charmed Manhattan, his suit looked wrinkled, his expression tired, his confidence drained by weeks of testimony, evidence, and the truth he could no longer outrun. The judge reviewed the findings, the manipulated financial records, the misleading statements, the pressure Madison endured, and the pattern of control uncovered throughout the investigation. The court didn't need dramatic revelations, only clarity. And clarity now stood against Connor from every angle. When the verdict was read, the room fell still. Connor was found responsible for his misconduct and held legally accountable for the harm his choices caused. His career collapsed, his company severed ties, and the reputation he guarded so fiercely dissolved in a single afternoon. There was no applause, no cheers, just the quiet, satisfying weight of justice settling into place. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered, but Madison spoke only one sentence: "I'm moving forward." Then she stepped into the sunlight, leaving the past behind. Months later, Madison stood on a quiet rooftop garden overlooking the East River. Lanterns glowed softly around her. Her close friends gathered for a small celebration. Noah waited at the end of the aisle, his smile warm and patient. Their ceremony wasn't grand, but it was tender, honest, and filled with hope, everything her life had lacked for so long. As Madison took Noah's hands, her child kicking gently beneath her dress, she finally felt the peace she had fought so hard to find. And when she looked out at the shimmering Manhattan skyline, she understood. Justice wasn't just delivered, it rebuilt her life into something beautiful. And just like that, our story comes to a close. You're still here with us, right? If you are, then something in Madison's journey must have touched your heart in its own quiet way. Maybe it reminded you of your own strength, or of the storms you've walked through. As Marcus Aurelius once wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." Madison's pain didn't end her, it rebuilt her. And so can yours. If this story gave you even a little courage or comfort, please like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to our channel. We'll keep walking these stories of healing together, one chapter at a time.